Hey friends, welcome back to Homestead on a Prayer. In case you're new here, my name's Jennifer and I'm gardening here in Connecticut in Zone 6. Today we're out in my main vegetable garden. It's getting close to the end of July, so this is going to be the late July garden tour. And I'm really excited to show you guys what's going on in the garden. There is a lot that is really looking great and finally getting into full swing. Now, as normally happens in late summer, the garden is also starting to get a little bit unruly. You're going to see a little bit of chaos, you're going to see some signs of disease starting to set in, but hopefully you will also see the beauty that I see in this garden, and you will also see the abundance of food that we're either harvesting now or will be harvesting soon. So I'm so glad you guys are here joining me in my garden this morning. Let's go take a look and I'll show you how all the vegetables are doing. So over here you can see that the zucchini patch is growing pretty wild. The zucchini plants are getting pretty big. Despite that, we have not actually had a harvest of zucchini yet, although I did spot one growing over there, so we're going to go take a closer look at that in a minute. You can see the zinnias are finally starting to bloom. The cucumbers are climbing up the trellis. There's a little bit of, I don't know if this is disease or sunburn or damage, I'm not really sure. There's a little bit of this going on with some of my cucumbers. You can see a little bit over there too. Now, people always joke, especially gardeners always joke. You've probably heard, kind of the running joke about being overwhelmed with zucchini. Don't leave your car unlocked if you have a neighbor who gardens because they'll leave zucchini in your car, things like that. I will say I've never really had that issue. I mean, granted, I usually do only grow a few zucchini plants, but they usually just produce about what we actually want. We don't usually get overwhelmed with a lot of zucchini. I'm not sure if that's just our area. I don't really know what the reason is for that. But either way, we are starting to get some zucchini. We haven't harvested any yet, but we're really just here in Connecticut. We're a little bit behind this year, and we're really just getting started in the summer harvest season, even though, as much as I hate to say it, it does sort of feel like summer's starting to wind down. But as far as the garden's concerned, or at least as far as the harvest of the garden is concerned, we're really just getting started. Now down here, you can see my first zucchini that's actually harvestable size. I should come out and pick this one sometime today so that it doesn't get to a really big size. And then over there you can see my other large zucchini plant. This one I think is a long white of Palermo zucchini, which is my first year growing this one, so I'm really excited to try that. One thing about zucchini is that the fruits do grow really fast. So once you see a zucchini fruit appear, you want to check on it every day and keep an eye on it, because zucchini really does taste best when it's harvested on the small side. Now, that being said, I do always have some that get pretty big, and usually some I'll intentionally actually grow pretty large because those actually still make great zucchini bread. So if I get a big one, I just like to grate it up and shred it and then mix it into zucchini bread, and it's really good. You can also freeze your grated zucchini like that, and it's great again for zucchini bread. It's great for throwing in soups or just adding a little bit of, just kind of a little pop of veggies to something over the winter, especially when you don't have a lot growing in your garden. So because of that, I do like to let a few get kind of large, but that one is a pretty good size, so I'm going to go ahead and pick that one when we're done with this garden tour, and then we'll figure out what we're going to do with our first zucchini of the year. Now over in the back of the zucchini bed, you can see I've got a couple more zucchini plants back here. We've also got tomatoes on the trellis, which you can see they've been pretty heavily affected by disease at this point. We've had a lot of rain this year, and tomatoes are prone to disease anyway, but especially when you have hot, humid conditions, that just kind of speeds up the development of disease. So kind of like anything in the garden, or really anything in nature, there's advantages and disadvantages to everything. We've had so much rain this summer, which on the one hand has been great. I have barely had to water my garden, and so that's been really nice. It's freed up a lot of time for me. But it does also really contribute to the spread of diseases, as you can see in my tomato plants. Tomatoes, as I said, are kind of prone to disease, and when you have hot, humid conditions for days and days on end, they're likely to develop disease a little bit earlier. Despite that, I do have quite a few tomatoes on my plants, some of which are even starting to ripen, which is really exciting. So I am hopeful that we'll be able to get a good harvest before my tomato plants completely succumb. But as you can see, I do have quite a bit of work to come out here and do to try to maintain these tomato plants and try to limit the spread of the disease as much as possible. Honestly, I haven't really had a chance to do it because we've just been having rain. Last night we actually had a huge rainstorm, a huge thunderstorm. We got several inches of rain in a really short amount of time, and I actually have some repair work to do in the garden, which you'll see as we continue on. Now down here you can see my purple bush beans are yielding. We've been harvesting beans from these plants, and it looks like they're ready for another harvest. And over here you can see, despite the tomato disease, you can see I do have some tomatoes ripening. These sort of brick red ones on the end, that's Paul Robeson. Now here in Connecticut, we're behind a lot of you in the South. I know those of you in the South have probably been harvesting tomatoes for weeks, maybe even months. And honestly, in some places you might even be starting to wind down with your tomato harvest. But in Connecticut, we are definitely behind a lot of the country, and we're actually behind where we usually are even for Connecticut this year because we had such a cold start to summer. So I've been harvesting cherry tomatoes for a while, but I am still waiting for my first ripe slicer. We do have a lot in the garden that are pretty close, so I'm thinking that'll come within the next couple days. Now, speaking of tomatoes and speaking of tomato diseases, across the walkway from my zucchini bed, you can see lots of tomatoes here, which really need some maintenance. You can see a lot of that tomato disease. I think it's some kind of blight. But despite that, you can see that there are quite a few tomatoes that are starting to ripen and lots of green ones still to come. And in front of those tomatoes, you can see one of my in-ground pepper beds. Now, these are starting to yield. We're starting to get some peppers off of them. They look fairly healthy, but they still do not compare to the peppers that I'm growing in pots on my deck. So the last time that I showed you guys all the plants I have growing on my deck, I actually posted that as a separate garden tour. I did kind of my main garden tour, and then I did a separate container garden tour. And I think that worked really well, so I think I'm going to do that again this time. So we won't take a look at the plants on my deck in this tour, but that will probably be the next video or possibly the video after that. We'll do a second garden tour just focusing on the container garden. I find that these videos tend to run a little bit long, and when I combine my regular main in-ground garden with the container garden on my deck, it just gets too long. So for today, we're going to focus on this garden, but definitely check back if you're interested in seeing my peppers and other plants that I have growing on containers in my deck, because we'll be doing that really soon. Now here's the back of that same tomato bed. You can see that everything is still kind of wet out here from the rain that we had. But we had to come out first thing in the morning because it's going to get so hot later today that I think it'll be too hot to do a garden tour, and it'll be too bright and sunny. So we are starting to get quite a few tomatoes. Over here you can see this is a new variety I'm growing. It's called Stupicka, and those are definitely on the smaller side, but there seem to be a lot of them. I haven't tried those yet. So you can see even up here there's more little clusters growing. It seems like it's kind of halfway between a cherry tomato and a small slicer. So we'll keep an eye on those and see how they do. So I'm so excited about this tomato here. This one is a black brandywine. I've never grown this variety before, but this tomato looks big and meaty and obviously starting to ripen. So I'm really excited to try that variety because I've heard that it's amazing. This tomato may have just the faintest blush on it. This is a pineapple tomato, which again, really excited about that. And over here is my Cindy's West Virginia tomato. You can see this seems to have quite a few tomatoes on it. And this plant, I will say, looks pretty healthy compared to most of the other plants in my garden. You can see all the foliage at the top still looks really healthy. So in case you missed some of my earlier garden tours this season, I did mention that I'd actually never heard of that tomato variety before. That was recommended to me by a neighbor who lives down the street. And knowing that it grows really well by someone who just lives a mile or two from my house is kind of a good recommendation. If you can find recommendations for varieties that do really well in your area from local gardeners, that's going to be your best source. I mean, I can recommend varieties that I love that have great flavor that do really well, but it might be different in your area. So your best bet, go ahead and get all the recommendations that you want from people online and people across the country or across the world. But your best bet is really to talk to people that are as local as possible and find out what varieties they really like and what varieties do well in their area. Now, all that being said, I have not harvested any ripe tomatoes from that plant yet, so I can't speak to the flavor of it. But it seems to be performing better than a lot of the tomatoes in my garden, so I'm taking that as a good sign so far. And some of those tomatoes are pretty big, and I actually think I see a faint blush on one of them. So hopefully within the next week or so, I'll actually be able to assess the flavor of that plant too. Now over here, looking at the other side of my cucumber trellis, there's quite a few cucumbers. And this one here, this is a nice big silver slicer. This definitely needs to be picked. So I'll be bringing this inside when I'm done with this video along with that zucchini. And you can see there's another one that's just a couple days away. I've got lots of pickling cucumbers in various stages of development here. So those will be really good and tasty. We have been harvesting cucumbers for the last week or so. We've gotten quite a few actually, and they've been really delicious. So cucumber season is really just getting started, along with a lot of other things this time of year. I have not harvested enough to make pickles yet, but I'm really looking forward to that. Refrigerator pickles especially are really easy and really delicious. I actually have a video where I made those last year, so I'll go ahead and link that if you're interested. It's a delicious recipe, and I can't wait for enough of my pickling cucumbers to come in that I can make a few jars of those to stick in the fridge because they're really good. They're a great taste of summer. Now, I would say, at least visually, the showstopper in my garden right now is these beautiful bean trellises. These are starting to yield actual beans. Through here you can see a lot of these beans. This particular variety is called Vortex. You can see this is a rounded green bean, and this is one of my favorite varieties. Yields really well, nice sweet tender beans. There's definitely a lot here that are ready to harvest, so I need to come out here, and so I'm thinking we'll be having green beans for dinner tonight. Now on the other side of the trellis I have rattlesnake beans. These are a little bit later yielding, so you can see they're really just getting started. I do have a few here and here. There's some that are actually ready to pick. Now these typically will have purple streaks on them. Right now they really just look green. I don't know if that's because they're growing under the trellis and they're kind of blocked from the sunlight. A lot of times the sunlight will kind of trigger the development of those pigments. So we'll see as the season goes on. Hopefully we will get some with purple streaks. I don't see any on that one either. Now my second bean trellis, I always love the look of these purple beans. They just are so beautiful. So a nice bonus if you're growing purple beans or some color other than green like this is that they're a lot easier to spot against the foliage. Makes harvesting a little bit easier, and I just think they're really pretty. They add a nice contrast to the garden. Now, of course, these purple beans do turn green when you cook them, which is a little disappointing. A lot of times I'll undercook them to try to preserve a little bit of that purple color. Sometimes I'll just cut them up and serve them raw in a salad so you get to really enjoy the purple. But whether you cook them or keep them raw, whether they're purple or green, they're still delicious and definitely worth growing. So through here, you can see I've got a couple more zucchini plants, which are pretty large. And I've got another tomato trellis over here. Now, you can see similarly, this one has a lot of green tomatoes, some starting to ripen. This one has been affected by disease as well. Maybe not quite to the same extent as the other trellis, but there's definitely some work that has to be done out here. Now under here was my kale and cauliflower, which did not do well this year. I've actually ripped most of it out and I've replanted. I don't know if you can see that very well through the mesh. I'm trying to shake the water drops off. But I replanted some little broccoli seedlings. Those will be fall broccoli, which will hopefully yield for us before it gets really cold. I really appreciate plants like brassicas, like broccoli, kale, cabbage, all those types of plants, because you can grow them in both the spring and the fall, which means if they don't do well for you in the spring, you have a second chance to grow them in the fall. In fact, a lot of people will say that they have better success growing those types of plants in the fall than in the spring. I actually find that I tend to have better success in the spring. It might kind of depend on your area, but I do always try them for the fall and usually do end up getting something. So I stuck in those little broccoli plants. I do need to start some more kale plants for the fall. Might be a little bit late for me in my area. My frost is usually mid-October, but I'm gonna go ahead and give it a try anyway. We'll see how they do. Worst case scenario, I have found that kale often will overwinter, especially if you give it a little protection. You can see I have this netting up right now. But when it gets colder, I'm going to take the netting down and I'll replace this with clear plastic instead to make almost like a mini greenhouse in there. And that should help my kale to at least overwinter, and then worst case scenario, if we don't have any over the winter, we'll be able to harvest it in the spring. Here is my cherry tomato patch. You can see it's overgrown and you can't really even tell which plant is which. But there's lots of ripe tomatoes in there. We've been harvesting cherry tomatoes for a while. And it looks like, judging by the amount of green tomatoes on here, we will still be harvesting them for quite a while to come. I mentioned that, oh, you can hear my chickens in the background, they're really excited about something. I did mention that we had a pretty serious rainstorm last night. I did try to come out and harvest all the tomatoes that looked really close to ripe before that storm. A lot of times what you'll find is when you get a really heavy rain like that, it can do a couple things. The most obvious thing is that it can cause your tomatoes to split, especially if you get a heavy rain after a long period of no rain. That uneven watering causes the plant to just take up as much water as possible really fast while it's raining. A lot of that gets sent to the tomatoes, and sometimes the tomatoes will grow too fast for the skins to stretch and they'll end up bursting. Now, if you find a burst cherry tomato or a split cherry tomato, you can definitely still eat it. you just want to go ahead and eat that one right away before it gets a chance to rot or to have bugs in it or anything like that. But if you find one that's freshly split, it's still delicious. They just won't really store very long. The other thing that rain can do is it can kind of dilute the flavor of your tomatoes. So if I do have tomatoes, you can see I have some out here that are actually pretty close to ripe, but I'm not going to harvest those. I probably won't even pick them today. I'm going to wait until tomorrow where they can be out in the sun and dry out a little bit, and it can concentrate the flavor a little bit more, as opposed to you'll find if you harvest your tomatoes right after a heavy rain, a lot of times they won't have that same concentrated flavor. They'll be a little weaker. So because of that, we won't be harvesting these today. We'll be waiting till tomorrow afternoon when they've hopefully had some sunshine. So here's a look at the other side of this tomato jungle. You can see we have a few different varieties over here. Try to grow a big variety of colors if I can. Now across the walkway here, you can see I have some tiny little tomatoes here. This was my garlic patch, but you can see I've replanted this with mini tomatoes, and I will point out to you guys that I did not split up my seedlings. You can see I have them growing 2 by 2, which is not recommended. That's just what I did because honestly, at this point I just had to get them in the ground. So last year I did an experiment. When I pulled my garlic out, I basically replanted some tomato seedlings in that same spot. I tried to choose a determinate tomato variety. That means that it will ripen all of its fruit at once for the most part. And I tried to choose one with a fairly short maturity date to try to give myself the best possible chance of harvesting a lot of fruit from this before they get killed by frost. So I'm doing that again this year. Of course, I had high hopes of planting these a couple weeks earlier than I did, but life happened and a lot of rain happened. I didn't get to harvest my garlic on time. So these are a little bit behind. This is honestly a bit of a risk. I'm not sure how much I'll get to harvest before frost, but I decided that it's worth a try and we're going to see what happens. So I did start these plants probably about 6 to 8 weeks before planting them out. So I planted them deeply the same way you plant regular tomato seedlings. So we are going to just let these grow and hope for the best. My philosophy in the garden is that it's always worth trying something. If we don't get a harvest, then we don't get a harvest, but at least we tried. If we didn't try, we would definitely not get a harvest. So this way, this ground, this growing area here isn't getting wasted. We're going to give it its best shot to grow something and see what happens. Now over here, this thing that looks like a wild jungle is actually my second in-ground pepper bed. And you can see my cute little pink zinnias just started blooming. These are so pretty. So again, these peppers are not doing as well as the peppers on my deck, but I think we will still get something. Looks like we've got some shishitos ready to harvest here. Those are delicious, so I've been wanting to harvest more of those. And then another look at the tomatoes from this side. So over here behind my cucumbers, this was my broccoli bed. Broccoli's pretty much done, so I'm going to go ahead and pull that out and try to get some more fall crops started here. I just haven't had a chance to do that yet, but that'll hopefully be happening soon. And here's a cucumber that's wandered away and needs to be tucked up into this trellis again. Now here on the fence, you can see I pulled out my peas. They were dried up and crispy and pretty much done. So I did pull them all out, and I have replanted a few seeds. They have not germinated yet. I just replanted these a couple days ago. So it'll be a little while till we see germination. So every year I try to grow fall peas. Peas are another plant that you can grow in both the spring and then again in the fall. I've never been incredibly successful, so I don't know if I'm just planting my peas too late. That's a possibility. There's kind of this dance you have to do with fall crops because they're fall crops because they don't like the summer heat. So I want to plant them early enough that they have time to mature before it gets really cold. But I want to plant them late enough that they're not growing in the summer heat and really struggling because of that. So it's a little bit of a challenge to find that right time to plant them. But every year I try it. I purposely bought extra peas this year, extra pea seeds in the spring, knowing that I was going to be trying to plant them in the fall. So I've planted along three sections of my fence, and over the next couple days I'll be planting out the rest of it. Hopefully I'm planting early enough that we'll be able to get a fall harvest. The other variable is that fall weather can be really weird, really unpredictable. We never really know what we're going to get, but we're going to give it a try. We're going to hope for a little bit of a late frost, which is my hope every single year. So again, this year we're going to hope for a late frost and hopefully be able to get a little bit of a harvest out of those peas. So as we head over into the side yard garden, we're going to pass the raspberry patch. The summer raspberries are kind of winding down. You can see there's still some in there. But the beautiful thing about this raspberry variety is that it makes 2 harvests a year. So you can see here it's already getting started on its fall crop. So it's setting second set of flowers. These will be ready usually towards the end of summer, beginning of fall, and we'll get a few weeks of a second crop of raspberries, which is really exciting. Now as we head over into the side yard garden, take a look at this tomato jungle. Now I mentioned that we had a lot of rain last night. These tomatoes did not handle it well and they kind of fell over. So I've mentioned many times that tomato cages are not the ideal support for indeterminate tomatoes. This is why. The tomatoes just really get too big for the cages to really support them. They just become really top heavy, and when something happens like heavy wind, heavy rain, we had both of those last night, this kind of thing happens. So I was tempted to fix these and show you a much nicer looking garden tour, assuming that I actually can fix these well. I'm not sure. So we'll give that a try. But I decided to show you what happens when you try to support your tomatoes with something that's not really ideal. Now, it's not the end of the world. These tomatoes will be fine. I'll pull them back upright and we'll still get a great harvest from them. But it would be a little easier if I had a better support for them. So these tomatoes, you can see even in their bedraggled state, they look really healthy. They actually look healthier than the tomatoes in my main garden. You can see we're starting to get some tomato fruits. Lots of tomatoes back there just waiting to ripen. And this tomato has decided to sprawl and take up as much space as possible. But it looks like it's giving me lots of tomatoes, so I think I'm going to forgive it for its wandering ways. And then over here, my fallen tomatoes, you can see lots of tomatoes hiding in there. Little bits of disease, but overall looks a little better than my main garden. Now this tomato plant is nice and upright, and you can see the reason is that it got really tall. It outgrew this cage by several feet, and I started tying the top branches to my cattle panel trellis here. So this tomato has held up really well. This one I'm thinking is a later variety. It's just now really starting to get some buds. Over here you can see a few flowers just starting. Now, while it's really tempting to grow a lot of early varieties of tomatoes to just try to get those tomatoes as soon as possible, get that first taste of summer, I always like to grow a few later varieties too, because I find that the early varieties are wonderful. I love to get that first taste of summer, but they don't usually hold up all season. So by growing some that yield later, the plants tend to stay a little bit healthier longer. That way I'll actually get some tomatoes. Once the rest of my tomatoes are kind of done, I'll still hopefully be getting tomatoes off this plant and maybe a couple of my others. Now I know it's hard to see with the tomatoes kind of laying over everything else, but you can see I have a few nice basil plants in here. Got some nasturtiums and zinnias mixed in. So we've been harvesting some really delicious basil from this garden bed over here. Now across the walkway, the strawberries are done for the year. I mean, this was the first year of them being planted. Technically, you're not even supposed to allow them to fruit. They fruited a little bit, and I kind of let them. But you can see we've got bush beans mixed in, and we've been harvesting beans from this bed too. You can see in here, there's quite a few beans growing. I think this is important in any garden, but especially if you have a smaller garden than you'd really like, and you don't really have the space for everything that you want to grow, it's important to really maximize your space. I know, my husband will tell you, I pack the most things possible into the smallest space possible, especially when it comes to my garden. Now this is a strawberry bed here, but I knew the plants weren't going to get that large this year. It's their first year. So I planted bush beans in between them. Another thing I like to do is make sure I have a staggered harvest. Now, bush beans will yield earlier than pole beans. I generally prefer pole beans. I think that they have a little bit better flavor, a little bit better yield. The plants are a little more reliable, I think. They yield over a longer season. But they take a little bit longer to yield to get that first harvest from. Bush beans are much quicker. So I like to grow some bush beans too. And honestly, I like to grow some varieties in bush beans that you can't find in pole beans. So just for the sake of variety, for the sake of extending the harvest season and maximizing space, I really like to grow some bush beans also. Bush beans, by the way, are a great crop to plant in between some of your larger crops. They don't take up a lot of space. They don't get really tall, so they won't be really crowding out your other plants, and they're a really quick turnaround. Some of them, it's 50, 60 days from seed to harvest, and because of that, it's a great plant for succession sowing or interplanting, and I find that it's really, really flexible. And as a bonus, they're in the legume family, which means that they're going to enrich the soil they grow in, and by planting them, you're really investing in your future harvest by just improving the health of your soil. Now the sweet potatoes are doing exactly what they should be this time of year. They're just growing and sprawling and vining all over the place, taking up a lot of space and sprawling out over the edges of the bed. So I'm hoping this is another one of those plants that grows underground, and you don't really know what kind of harvest you're going to get until harvest time. I just harvested all my regular potatoes recently, and I mentioned that those are really fun to harvest because it's kind of a surprise. Sweet potatoes, of course, are the same way. They grow underground, and you don't really know what you're going to get until you actually harvest them. So it'll just be a fun surprise. These I'm going to let go until pretty close to frost so that they get the maximum growing time possible. So right now, even though I have no idea what's going on under the ground, I'm really happy with how they look so far. We'll go past the sweet potato bed and into what used to be the potato bed. You can see this is fairly empty at this point. We did come out and harvest the potatoes, and you can see I have a few tomato plants planted here, which are really tiny. Again, this is a little bit of a risk. These tomato plants are tomato suckers that I actually rooted from my regular plants, from my original plants. So tomato plants will produce suckers, which I prefer to prune off. The thing is though, when you prune them off, you can stick them in a glass of water or in a little pot of soil, and most of the time they'll grow roots and become a whole new tomato plant. So it's a little bit quicker than starting from seed, and you're making use of something that you would otherwise be pruning off and discarding. So I've got 4 tomato plants out here that I started from suckers. I'm not sure how well they're going to do. They don't look incredibly healthy because I left them in their pots a little too long, and they really should have gotten in the ground sooner. But I had to wait until I harvested my potatoes and had space. So I've got those growing in there. We're going to keep an eye on them, and again, we're going to hope for a harvest and see what happens. Now on the other side of the bed here, I did plant some seeds for some more bush beans and some more zucchini plants. And the hope is that we'll be able to get a fall harvest of those. Now all of the plants that I've planted here, the tomatoes, the zucchini, the beans, those are all frost sensitive, which means that when the frost comes, they'll all die. But they're all quick enough to maturity, maybe not the tomatoes so much, but the others all have a really quick maturity date. And so the hope is that I will be able to get a second harvest off of all of those before the frost comes and kills them. Again, gardening takes a lot of hope, I think, a lot of hope and faith and a little bit of risk tolerance. But if you're willing to invest, then most of the time, I find that most often I get rewarded, at least to some extent, just for taking the time to invest in my plants. Now this bed here, there isn't a lot of really specific things to show, but you can see that my butternut squash is starting to climb the trellis. I've got a few other plants along there. These flowers are looking really pretty. You can see I've got the nasturtiums and a few different colors of bachelor's buttons mixed in. And through here, again, I pulled out this chickweed, but I don't think I got all the roots. As you can see, it's regrowing. So it's a little bit of a wild and unruly jungle in here. Despite that, I think we're going to get a respectable harvest at least. Now, in this little pot here, I know this doesn't look like anything, but this is hopefully going to become my fall cucumber harvest. Cucumbers are another plant that is frost sensitive. They will not live through a frost, and so the hope with those is to be able to get the harvest before the frost comes and kills them. But they're also another really quick maturing vegetable, and so I think that it's worth the risk. So what happened in this garden here, a lot of the things that I planted on these trellises did not end up doing very well. So I'm hoping to grow those cucumbers. Those are all pickling cucumbers. So I'm hoping to use those to replace and fill in some of the space on some of the plants that I had originally planted here that didn't end up growing. And again, we will see what happens. I had nothing to lose there. I had plenty of extra seeds. So we're going to give it a try and hopefully get some fall cucumbers. So I think that's really about all that's going on in the garden right now. I will definitely film a container garden tour, as I mentioned, really soon and show you guys what's going on my deck. I'm hoping to get to that within the next couple days. But thank you guys so much for hanging out with me in the garden today. Even though the garden is wild and unruly this time of year, I really love it. This is one of the times of year when, you can get a little bit overwhelmed. It's hot, the plants are starting to get diseased, there's a lot of garden maintenance to keep up with. It can be really easy to just feel overwhelmed and kind of done. And honestly, I have had to battle some of that this year. But this is also one of the times of year when the garden is the most rewarding. You've been working hard all year and you're finally starting to get some really delicious harvest for your efforts. And so I'm willing to let the garden be a little bit unruly, and I still love it exactly how it is. So thank you guys so much for walking through my garden with me on this hot and sticky morning. I hope that you are having a great day, that your gardens are growing well, and I can't wait to see you soon. I'll see you next time.